deeply troubling. Unacceptable. Yes, those were the words of the Lady Chief Justice, throwing barbs at the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition over what they dared talk about at Prime Minister's Questions last week. My name's Tom Harwood and this is GBN Originals. Well, it's almost a tale of old as time. The politicians versus the judges. The untouchable judges, the separation of the judiciary and the legislature, that famous separation of powers. But wait, it's not. Because Britain doesn't have a separation of powers. Britain is not America. Britain doesn't have a codified constitution, a document that legally sits above the British Parliament. In Britain, Parliament is sovereign. That is the legal principle that was established after a bloody civil war in the 1600s. That is the legal principle that underpins the lives we live. And so it's strange to see a judge suddenly say what politicians may or may not talk about in the House of Commons. The Commons, of course, is privileged. Members of Parliament may stand and say things that, frankly, are illegal to say elsewhere in the country. That special privilege of the Commons has been defended and protected for centuries in this country. The independence of Parliament and the supremacy of Parliament is what built this country. It's what made this country soar above its competitors through hundreds of years, helped facilitate the Industrial Revolution and the greatest empire the world has ever known. Why? Because we raised Parliament above all other arms of the state. Suddenly, we had a pluralistic form of government, not a king or a commissar. Not even a cleric could overrule what Parliament said. Parliament is supreme. On that principle, this country rests. So why then did the Lady Chief Justice wade her oar into what the elected Prime Minister and Leader of the Opposition dared speak of at Prime Minister's Questions? Well, they said that a judgment was wrong, an immigration judgment, a judgment that leveraged a Ukrainian settlement scheme to allow a family of Gazans to settle in the UK. Clearly, Parliament wanted to express its wish that that scheme was only used by Ukrainians. That this particular Gazan family should not have, in the way that they did, have the right to settle in this country. A judge disagreed, but clearly the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition have another view. And it's their right to have another view. And yet, the most senior member of the judiciary in this country almost thought that she outranked the Prime Minister on this issue, that she outranked Parliament. Well, I'm afraid that's not how this country works.
Using the internet without a VPN, a virtual private network, is a bit like taking to the road without car insurance. All it takes is one unlucky moment to cost you a lot of cash. This video's sponsor is Private Internet Access. They are the VPN to help keep you safe. Click the link in the description below to find out why over 30 million people have downloaded PIA to protect themselves online. A virtual private network is an app that hides your IP address and helps keep your data private. When you're browsing the internet at home, you give up a large amount of data to businesses, to shops, and indeed to social media giants too. Hackers have the ability to steal your personal data with ease, including sensitive information such as passwords, keystrokes, and even your personal photos. Private Internet Access helps protect your personal data by encrypting your internet connection to keep your data out of the hands of cyber criminals. And it's not just hackers either to be concerned about. Information can be censored too. When Canada passed their C-18 bill, social media giants decided to ban news content on their platforms. But PIA can protect your ability to consume the news and content you love. Private Internet Access is available for Windows users, Mac OS, Android, Linux, iOS, and you can use one PIA subscription to protect an unlimited amount of devices. And we've got a huge GB News discount for you too. Click the link in this video's description and you'll get a massive 83% off PIA. That's under £2 a month the price of a coffee, and you'll get an extra 4 months completely free on top. Also, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee too. Visit piavpn.com/GB News to start protecting yourself digitally today.
Parliament has every right to make any law that it fancies. Parliament has any right to be the end of the line for these issues. If Parliament disagrees with a judgment, it can literally write a law to overturn that judgment. That's a far cry from many other countries, and I'm afraid far too many commentators have become obsessed, perhaps, with a foreign way of thinking when it comes to the Constitution. Because yes, Britain does have a Constitution, but it's uncodified. It's written through convention and thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of documents, every law that Parliament passes. Yes, Parliament is sovereign. That is the fundamental issue at play. And yet that seems to be an issue that's being challenged by a judiciary that wants to encroach upon the traditional liberties of our legislature. It's strange that since 2005, when Tony Blair's reforms led to the establishment of the Supreme Court, we moved the Law Lords, as they were known, out of the House of Lords just across the other side of Parliament Square to what became the Supreme Court. But those individuals are still members, many of them still members of the House of Lords. That in itself explains how there is no separation of powers. Unlike in the United States, where you can't be a member of the judiciary and the legislature, well, the Lady Chief Justice is herself a member of the House of Lords. She is herself part of the legislature of this country. What better example of how wrong so many commentators have been on this issue? But it's clear that there is judicial encroachment, what many commentators often describe as legislating from the bench, the idea that judges, unelected as they are, want to be lawmakers rather than those that interpret the will of Parliament. And in their holier-than-thou interpretation of what Parliament is doing, in their presumption in many ways to almost legislate through their judgments, are they growing too big for their boots and forgetting that the rule-making authority in this country must lie with Parliament, must lie with those politicians, not those judges? Well, we've had a heated debate about this here on GB News this week. And first, let's bring you the thoughts of the barrister Steven Barrett. Now, he has some pretty punchy views on whether or not the House of Commons should be supreme in this regard, whether or not judges have gone too far. And we even reference the Civil War, that idea that Parliament was victorious over the Crown and any other arm of the state. Let's listen in.
It's quite the intervention, Stephen. What do you make of it?
Yes, it is, and it's a constitutional mistake. I'd like to thank Tom for his passionate defence of our constitution. It's quite important that people know how it is, how it's different from other constitutions, and how it works, because he's right to highlight that we got ourselves into the Industrial Revolution and made ourselves very, very wealthy by being able to use Parliament. Okay, and that's why Parliament is the most important thing. It can do all sorts of extraordinary things. It could pass an act specifically overturning this case if it wanted to. It can pass an act sacking judges if it wants to. Parliament is supreme. It's really quite a mistake for the Lady Chief Justice to have done this. I call this Versailles thinking. There seems to be an air of going around that certain elite people are above or beyond criticism. Well, I'd just like to point out that is not British. That is not our system. And you can always criticise judges. Of course, we are more than welcome to do so. I mean, you mustn't threaten violence, obviously, or do anything illegal, but criticising people, even your betters, is perfectly possible in a democracy. That's what a democracy is. I think this problem has arisen because of Tony Blair's constitutional changes in 2005. Previously, we would have had a Lord Chancellor who was also a judge and a senior politician, and he or she could have listened to the concerns, if there are concerns of the judiciary, and taken action and fixed things or settled feathers and calmed everyone down. Such a person would be an experienced politician, which the Lady Chief Justice is not. And what's happening here really is the Lady Chief Justice is being sucked into the vacuum that Tony Blair has created. And now she's holding a press conference? No. I strongly suggest that we repair the Constitution and save the Lady Chief Justice from these burdens, and we all stop Versailles thinking, or we'll all end up how Versailles ended up.
Extraordinary, given that we sort of pretend that we have a separation of powers so often in this country, because we established a Supreme Court that sits separately from Parliament. Of course, the Law Lords used to sit in the House of Lords. I mean, Baroness Sue Carr, the Lady Chief Justice, is literally a parliamentarian. She has a seat in the House of Lords. There is no separation of the legislature and the judiciary as there is in other countries. It's literally fused. And yet, it's extraordinary. Not only journalists who might be forgiven for sort of watching too much West Wing or whatever else it is, but also members of the judiciary themselves. The Lady Chief Justice. Now almost sort of trying to invent a new system where justices sit above and over our elected parliament, which has never been the case.
No, and you're quite right to point to the Civil War, because judges really represent royal power. And the whole point is that Parliament beat royal power and Parliament is in charge. That's why Parliament created the Supreme Court and moved the Law Lords, because it has supreme power to do things. And that cannot be forgotten. We need to remember our Constitution. We've had repeated instances of members of the elite who really have brainwashed themselves into thinking that our Constitution is what it isn't. And we really need to go back to a deep understanding of our Constitution and how things work. Otherwise, we'll never get ourselves out of any of these messes. The President of the Supreme Court had a really lovely phrase where he called it a widespread misunderstanding of the Constitution has arisen. Well, it shouldn't really have reached the Lady Chief Justice, should it? I mean, this is, this is a problem. And I'm sure many barristers watching this will be thinking, oh dear, he shouldn't be saying that. Oh gosh, no, that's terribly brave. At the end of the day, we've got to return to basic honesty and common sense. And we really need to understand our Constitution. If people don't understand it, I'm happy to teach them it. But,
Well, Stephen,
we do need to, or maybe Tom could do it.
Now, here on GB News, we want to hear all sides of the debate. So we brought on another lawyer, an immigration lawyer, Ivan Samson, to hear his point of view. And do forgive that I get slightly passionate.
Someone with a difference of opinion on this one, immigration lawyer Ivan Samson. Ivan, the Lady Chief Justice, a controversial intervention, your thoughts?
No, not at all. I think the principles of a democracy is a separation of powers, and that's between the executive and the judiciary. Our 1,000-year-old court system we don't have a constitution. What we have
Ivan,
is a separation.
Sorry, I'm so sorry to jump in. We don't have a separation of powers in the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is not the United States. Lady Chief Justice is not separated. She's literally a baroness. She sits in the House of Lords. She's a member of the legislature. We have no separation of power. It's utterly fused. And until 2005, it was the Law Lords who sat in the Lords that made these decisions. And now they sit in a slightly different building, the Supreme Court, but they're still members of the House of... There she is in her traditional robes that denote her as a member of the legislature. We do not have a separation of powers.
We'll just have to agree to disagree on that point, Tom. But can I ask you, Tom, have you read the judgment?
I have, yes. We discussed it. We discussed it last week, and I know there are a lot of things about this judgment. For example, it doesn't particularly hinge on the question of whether or not a Ukrainian settlement scheme paper was the vital point. I well know that. Go on.
Well, let me explain. It's very important, this point. It's on a point of law. The appeal was not on the facts. It was on a point of law. And the law principle was this, that the First Tier Tribunal failed to take into account the Ukrainian scheme in the balancing exercise when deciding whether to find in favor of the government, who got legitimate right to effect immigration control, and the appellant has a right to family and private life. Those are the two competing rights. And what the upper tribunal said was this. He said, look, the judge should have considered it. Now, the government are well in their rights to appeal that, and the Court of Appeal will then consider it and may well come to a different conclusion. So that's the way our law operates. People have a right to appeal.
Yeah, okay, Ivan, I understand that. I completely understand that. But do you believe that judges like Hugo Norton-Taylor, who took this very controversial decision, many people believe that he stretched the law, even manipulated the law. A lot of people believe that should be beyond reproach. Our politicians, our Prime Minister, our Leader of the Opposition shouldn't be able to at least discuss it in Parliament? Seriously?
No, they should. Look, it's dangerous precedent that this government is setting, because what you're trying to do is influence judges, make them fearful of making correct decisions because of what the politicians will say afterwards. There is an appeal process, and what they should have done was to appeal it. Now, they decided to attack the judge when the decision was legally sound. And if they didn't think it was legally sound, by all means appeal it. Now, you may not agree with it, Tom, the decision.
Let me speak up for the Prime Minister.
But the judge, in his wisdom, properly applied the law. If you don't like the law, change the law. Parliament has the law.
That's what they were discussing.
Isn't that precisely what I don't understand? Is why the Lady Chief Justice has slapped down the Prime Minister over this, because he didn't attack the judge. I could see why the Lady Chief Justice might say to various newspapers, you've been too mean about one of our judges, absolutely fine, whatever. The Prime Minister said he wanted to legislate to close a legal loophole.
He said the decision was wrong.
It isn't a loophole. Tom, there is no loophole. We are members of the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, the government on one hand had said, we're not going to come out of it. We are going to uphold the law. And they can't expect a judge to ignore that, a treaty, which we remember, that would be ridiculous.
Well, so it's not a prisoner voting, Ivan. What happened over prisoner voting when Parliament passed an act of Parliament directly contradicting a ruling from the European Court of Human Rights? It passed that law and we didn't introduce prisoner voting because in our constitution, unwritten though it is, Parliament is supreme over everything else, whether it's judges, whether it's foreign judges, Parliament has the say.
I agree 100% with you, Tom, on this point. And if they don't like the operation of the European Convention, how the judges come to these decisions, it's a very difficult decision to balance those exercises. And the judge is required to look at everything. Now, if they don't look at everything, it's unlawful. And that's what the upper tribunal said. That's all he said. He didn't say that they were right. What he said was it was unlawful because the first-tier tribunal did not look at a very important part. And there's got to be consistency of treatment. So you can't have a scheme for one people saying, well, Article 8 applies in their case, but doesn't apply in this case. So I think the judge is perfectly right and his decision is totally sound. And I'd be surprised.
Ivan, I've been speaking to you for a long time now, and I can't remember any case where you think the judge got it wrong. I genuinely can't, Ivan. And that's why sometimes I think that you are arguing from a position whereby you would literally just have open borders. Because whenever we discuss deportations, or when people believe that someone should have been deported, whether it's a foreign criminal or someone who came here illegally or whatever, you always seem to side with the judge's decision.
Well, let me tell you about my views, my personal views about foreign criminals. We should deport all of them. Okay, I've got children. I don't want my children walking on the streets with people who are committing crimes who are coming to our country. That's my personal view. But what I will apply is the law as it stands. That's what's expected of me, and that's what I will continue to do.
Well, what do you make of that? Do you think that the lawyers have gone too far in this country, that there is judicial overreach when it comes to legislation and how things are decided in this country? Do you want to return a reassertation of the rights and privileges of our Parliament, the sovereignty of our Parliament as has built this country over decades and indeed centuries? Do post your comments and your thoughts in the comment section below. But as always, do subscribe to the GB News YouTube channel for more original content like this.